Nia Harper moved like a whisper through the gleaming halls of Halberton Tower, her mop gliding across marble so polished it seemed to mirror the stars beyond the Manhattan skyline. Night after night she worked unseen, her navy blue janitor's uniform blending into the background of a corporate world that thrived on spotlight and power. To the executives who swept through these corridors, she was as invisible as the air conditioning that kept their meetings comfortable. And yet beneath her quiet exterior, Nia carried secrets no one suspected. Secrets written not in cleaning rosters or time cards, but in the flowing Arabic script that still haunted her dreams. At 32, she had mastered invisibility. Each night shift followed the same rhythm: empty offices, abandoned coffee cups, whispers of perfume and cologne that lingered long after their owners left. But on this particular evening, the rhythm faltered. From the slightly ajar door of conference room B came voices, urgent and sharp. Nia slowed her sweeping, her movements deliberate, her ears catching fragments of conversation that slipped into the hallway. "Al-Shaim lands in New York Thursday," one male voice said, tense and clipped. "If we botch this meeting, the merger is finished before it begins." A second voice, feminine and biting, cut through. "We won't botch it. I've researched Saudi business protocols. I know exactly how to impress him." Nia recognized the speaker, Marina Westfield, the firm's ambitious vice president of marketing. Marina was infamous among the cleaning staff for her careless habit of leaving her coffee cups on the floor beside her chair. She never once dropped them in the trash can just 2 steps away, always the same dismissive phrase, "Someone will get it." And that someone was always Nia. Her jaw tightened as she pushed her mop closer to the door, the swish of the water-laden strands nearly drowning the words. But she heard enough. Saudi billionaire Khalid Al-Shaim, a $200 million investment, the CEO demanding perfection, a translator scheduled. Nia absorbed the details without meaning to. She wasn't supposed to care, but something inside her held on to every piece of the puzzle. When the executives filed out minutes later, none looked her way. Nia ducked her head, feigning interest in a stubborn scuff mark near the door. They glided past her, all perfume, polished shoes, and self-importance. None of them saw the woman with the mop. None of them realized that she understood far more than they did about what lay ahead. By the time dawn spilled pale light over Brooklyn, Nia's shift was done. She unlocked the door of her modest apartment, the key turning with a tired click. The space was small but carefully kept, bargain furniture arranged with dignity, the walls adorned with vintage maps of North Africa and the Middle East, silent testaments to a past she had abandoned. "You're late," came a groggy voice from the couch. Her younger brother, Jordan, sat up, hair tousled, eyes heavy from hours of screen glow. He was 23, thin from skipped meals, shoulders slumped from burdens too heavy for his age. A laptop hummed beside him, the blue light carving shadows on his face. He held up a crumpled envelope. "Another loan notice," he muttered. Nia sighed, setting her bag down. She knew the envelope before he even showed it. Student debt, the ghost that refused to leave. Though Jordan had dropped out after his accident, the debt still clung like chains. "Don't worry," she said softly, sitting beside him. "We'll figure it out. We always do." She didn't mention the extra shifts, the side gig translating flyers for a local community center, the Oxford scholarship she had abandoned 14 years ago when tragedy struck. At 18, she had been ready to fly across the ocean, study Near Eastern languages at one of the world's finest universities, and shape a future bright with promise. But then their parents' accident had shattered everything. Overnight, she became guardian, provider, and protector. The path of dreams had bent beneath the weight of necessity. Jordan rubbed his face, frustration clouding his features. "You should have left me back then, Nia. Taken your scholarship, gone to Oxford. You'd be running those meetings now instead of cleaning after them." Nia shook her head, firm but gentle. "Family isn't something you walk away from. You needed me. That's all that mattered." When he retreated to his room, she pulled a worn book from her bag. Its Arabic verses flowed like rivers of ink across the page. She traced the script with her finger, her lips moving in silent recitation. For half an hour, she wasn't a janitor. She wasn't invisible. She was once again the scholar who had dazzled professors with her papers on cultural intelligence, the young woman who could weave languages into bridges between worlds. The following evening, back in the locker room at Halberton, her colleague Anna Torres, 15 years in cleaning, Her closest friend on the job gave her a wry smile. $10 says Marina spilled coffee again. Nia laughed softly as she tied her hair. You're probably right. Anna's eyes narrowed at the glimpse of Arabic script as Nia tucked her book into her locker. Girl, you're too smart to be here. My cousin's been in this country 5 years and can't even manage English. And you? You're reading, what is that? Egyptian, Hebrew. Arabic poetry, Nia replied simply. Anna shook her head, marveling. Too smart, I'm telling you. Before Nia could respond, their supervisor barked for all hands in the main lobby. Together, janitors, secretaries, security, and executives gathered under the gleaming chandelier. At the center stood Walter Langford, CEO of Halberton Tower, his voice echoing with rehearsed grandeur. Tomorrow, he proclaimed, marks a historic opportunity. Khalid al-Shaim, one of the wealthiest investors in the Middle East, will be here. His presence is not just financial, it is cultural. We must impress him at every turn. Executives nodded sharply, their gazes fierce with ambition. The janitors kept their heads down, their silent role already assumed. Walter never looked at them. His words about perfection and spotless preparation were meant for them, but his eyes never once saw them. As the crowd dispersed, Nia wheeled her cart toward the elevators. Brian Reynolds, an IT specialist with perpetually crooked glasses, caught her eye. He was one of the few who acknowledged her existence. Big day tomorrow, he said, adjusting his laptop bag. So it seems, she replied. They're panicking about the translator. He added in a lowered voice. Agency hasn't confirmed. Nia's pulse quickened. She said nothing, but the thought stayed with her long after the elevator doors closed. That night she dreamed of Oxford. The ancient stone halls, her professors' approving nods, the lecture hall where she once presented a paper on Arab investment in Western education. She had been so close, but in her dream, the podium dissolved into hospital monitors. The applause turned into medical bills, and the scholarship letter in her hand became a mop. She woke with tears on her cheeks, her alarm blaring her back to reality. Another night, another floor to mop. But something was shifting. Tomorrow, she knew, would not be just another night. The Tycoon's arrival and the storm of silence. The morning of Khalid al-Shaim's arrival dawned with an unusual restlessness inside Halberton Tower. From the moment the sun broke through Manhattan's misty skyline, the building hummed with nervous energy. Security personnel moved like shadows across the lobby, testing communication systems and running sweeps as if expecting an invasion rather than a business meeting. Florists carried in arrangements of exotic lilies and orchids, their fragrances competing with the polished smell of floor wax and lemon-scented wood polish. Caterers in crisp white coats lined up trays of delicate canapes and sparkling water, imported from European springs. Executives rehearsed speeches in hushed tones, glancing at one another with the tension of actors before the curtain rose. Every corner of the skyscraper seemed alive, pulsing with one single command: do not fail today. Nia Harper had been called in early, though she suspected no one even realized how many additional hours she'd already logged this week. She moved through the chaos silently, bucket and mop at her side assigned to the lobby, the very stage where the Tycoon's first impressions would be cast. The marble floors she had polished countless nights before gleamed so brightly now that they seemed to glow under the chandeliers. She was used to being invisible, but today, invisibility felt heavier. Executives brushed past her as though she were part of the decor, their voices clipped and impatient, their gestures sharp. Yet she listened, her keen ears catching more than they would ever guess. The whispers drifted, fragments of panic woven into careful disguises. Marina's voice, sharp with irritation, echoed near the elevators. The translator called in sick today of all days, she snapped at an assistant. Do you have any idea what this means? We've rehearsed these presentations for weeks, and now we're expected to communicate across a cultural chasm with nothing but half-baked apps? Another voice responded, tremulous. We have some translation software. And al-Shaim studied in the U.S., didn't he? Surely his English will suffice. Marina's heels clicked away, her words dripping with false confidence. It's not enough. A single misstep in etiquette could sink this deal. We cannot afford to appear ignorant. Nia continued polishing the glass walls, her rag moving in practiced circles, but inside her chest her heart began to beat harder. She remembered her professor at Oxford once warning, language is never just words, it is culture, history, pride, and identity. To mistranslate is to misrepresent the very soul of a people. She could already imagine the misunderstandings that would unfold, the strained smiles, the faltering respect. She had no role in that meeting, but the thought of it failing stirred something restless within her. By 4 o'clock sharp, the hum of luxury engines outside signaled his arrival. Through the glass doors, the motorcade of sleek black cars glided to a stop, their diplomatic plates glinting in the autumn light. The building seemed to inhale as the door slid open and Khaled Al-Shaim entered. He moved with the calm command of a man born into power yet sharpened by experience. Tall, with dignified bearing, his charcoal suit cut to perfection, he carried himself without ostentation yet radiated the presence of one accustomed to being obeyed. Gold cufflinks glimmered subtly at his wrists, not flashy but unmistakable in their refinement. His eyes swept the lobby in a single measured glance, registering not only the executives who scrambled to greet him, but also the security guards, the secretaries, the catering staff, and, just for a heartbeat, the janitor with the mop. Nia felt that gaze settle on her like a weight and then move on. Yet something in it lingered, a flicker of recognition she couldn't name. For a second she stood straighter, her mop pressed lightly against the marble, her pulse quickening at being truly seen. Walter Langford, the CEO, hurried forward with his rehearsed grin. "Mr. Al-Shaim, what an honor to welcome you to Halberton Tower." The Saudi billionaire shook his hand with practiced politeness. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Langford. I look forward to today's discussions." His English was impeccable, his tone courteous yet edged with something unmistakably discerning, as if every word, every movement, was being catalogued and evaluated. The executives formed a half-circle around him, guiding him toward the elevators. The cameras outside flashed furiously as reporters tried to catch glimpses of the dealmaker entering the building. Inside, employees who had no business on the ground floor lingered near the corridor, pretending to pass through, stealing glances at the man whose wealth could change the company's fate. In the conference room, the presentations began with polished slides and carefully scripted speeches. For a time, everything flowed smoothly. Al-Shaim listened with polite attention, occasionally leaning toward his advisors to exchange words in Arabic. Nia, stationed in the hallway polishing the glass walls, could hear the rolling cadence of the language, the subtle rhythm of syllables that had once been as natural to her as breathing. At first, his comments were brief, his English sufficient. But then the conversation turned complex. Questions of investment structures, long-term growth models, cultural partnerships. With a slight lift of his hand, Al-Shaim addressed his team in Arabic, his voice resonant, his phrasing formal. The language spilled into the air, smooth and deliberate like poetry threaded into logic. The executives froze. Marina, desperate to prove her preparedness, pulled out her phone. "We've got this," she whispered, tapping rapidly. She held the screen toward the Saudi team, the app stuttering through its synthetic voice. "It says you're worried about the camel structuring," the robotic tone mangled. A ripple of restrained amusement passed across the Saudi delegation. One of Al-Shaim's younger advisors pressed his lips tightly, stifling a smile. The executives blinked in confusion, their practiced confidence cracking. Al-Shaim's eyes cooled slightly. Switching back to English, he said, "I meant capital structuring. Perhaps technology is not always the solution." A faint flush spread across Marina's cheeks. "Of course," she said, her laugh brittle. "Just a little glitch." But the damage was already done. The atmosphere shifted, strained and uneven. Cultural nuances slipped through the cracks. Technical terms lost precision. The delicate balance of respect and trust wavered with every mistranslated phrase. And then Al-Shaim leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping the room. In Arabic, he spoke to his advisor, his tone calm but laced with quiet sharpness. They prepared everything except understanding. They see only money, not the mind behind it. Nia's hands froze mid-polish. She had been listening without intending to, but those words struck her like lightning. The executives in the room laughed nervously, oblivious. Marina's app blurted out a clumsy approximation. "The preparation is good. Money and mind work together." The mistranslation was not just wrong. It erased the sting, the truth, the warning that Al-Shaim had just voiced. Something inside Nia shifted. She could almost feel her professor's voice echoing across time. When you hear truth being bent, you have a choice, to stay silent or to speak. Her fingers tightened around the rag. Her breath quickened, and as Al-Shaim tested them further, delivering a long, elegantly layered statement in Arabic, deliberately complex, deliberately probing. The silence in the room grew heavy. No one responded. Marina tapped furiously at her phone, its app choking on syllables it could not handle. Before she realized she was going to do it, Naya turned from the glass wall, stepped through the doorway, and spoke. Her voice was soft, respectful, but clear. "You honor us with your wisdom," she said in flawless Arabic, her dialect formal, her tone steady. "You remind us that partnership cannot be built only on profit. It must be built on shared understanding, on respect, on foundations that do not shift like sand, but endure like stone." The room went still. The executives gaped, the mop still in her hand like a staff of authority she hadn't known she carried. Marina's face drained of color. Walter's eyes widened in disbelief, but Khalid Al-Shaim's expression softened into something else entirely. Surprise, recognition, and slowly a smile. "Naam," he said quietly. "Yes." And in that instant, the air in the room changed forever. The janitor's voice, the Tycoon's memory. The silence that followed Nia's words felt alive, as if the entire building itself had paused to witness what had just occurred. The executives, usually so confident and self-assured, stared in stunned disbelief. Marina's hand hovered uselessly above her phone screen, the failed translation app still open but forgotten. Walter Langford, the CEO who prided himself on control, looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. His carefully orchestrated meeting, his delicate performance to impress a billionaire, had been upstaged not by one of his polished vice presidents, not by his expensive technology, but by a janitor in a navy blue uniform with a mop still dripping water onto the pristine marble floor. Khalid Al-Shaim, however, did not look unsettled. Instead, a slow, deliberate smile spread across his face, the kind of expression that carried the weight of recognition, of understanding something no one else in the room had yet grasped. He rose slightly from his chair, his sharp gaze never leaving Nia, and in Arabic he asked her a question that carried both curiosity and authority. "Where did you learn to speak this language with such depth?" This is not the tongue of someone who memorized a phrase. This is the voice of one who studied, who lived the words. Nia hesitated only a fraction before replying in the same language, her tone modest but unshakably clear. "I studied Near Eastern languages and culture, sir. It was once my passion. I believe that language is more than communication. It is the key to understanding worlds." Gasps rustled through the room. Some of the executives looked scandalized, as if she had overstepped. Marina's face twisted into a thin smile, sharp as glass, her voice dripping with condescension. "Well, isn't that charming? Our janitorial staff rehearses Arabic poetry in her spare time. How very multicultural," but Al-Shaim silenced her with a glance. His focus remained wholly on Naya. Switching into English so all could hear, he said firmly, "Ms. Harper, would you be willing to act as interpreter for the remainder of this meeting? It seems you are the most qualified person in this room." The declaration landed like a thunderclap. Walter froze, his pride stung yet calculating, weighing humiliation against opportunity. At last he forced a smile. "Of course. No objection at all. Nia, please, assist us." And so, with hands that trembled only slightly, Nia set her mop aside and took a seat at the gleaming conference table. The eyes of every executive bore into her, some incredulous, some resentful, and one, Marina's, burning with fury. Yet Al-Shaim's gaze held something different: respect, curiosity, even recognition. For the next 2 hours, Nia translated with a precision that no machine could rival. She did not merely carry words across languages. She carried meaning, context, and cultural nuance. When Al-Shaim spoke of long-term investments, she conveyed not just financial terms but the unspoken emphasis on legacy, on continuity beyond mere profit. When executives presented strategies laced with Western idioms, she softened their sharp edges, aligning them with metaphors that resonated with Arab traditions. Her interpretations turned the meeting from awkward and fractured into fluid, engaging and unexpectedly productive. The executives began to lean on her, though none dared admit it aloud. Every time she spoke, bridging worlds with grace, the tension eased. Walter's fake smile gave way to genuine relief. Even Al-Shaim's advisors nodded approvingly, their pens flying across notepads, their sharp eyes no longer guarded but interested. By the time Walter called for a short recess, Nia felt drained but strangely exhilarated. For years she had existed on the margins of this building, scrubbing floors and erasing the traces of others' power. Yet here she was, seated at the table itself, her voice commanding the room. She could hardly believe it. When the executive stepped out, Al-Shaim approached her directly. His presence filled the space not with arrogance but with a quiet certainty. In Arabic, his words carried an intimacy that felt almost disarming. "Oxford, I remember you." The sentence struck her like lightning. She blinked, stunned. "You remember me?" His eyes softened. 5 years ago, a conference on Gulf investment in Western education. You delivered a paper on cultural intelligence. You spoke with such conviction that I told my colleagues you had a scholar's heart. I never forgot the clarity in your words. And now I find you here with a mop instead of a lectern. How did such brilliance end up in janitorial work? Memories flooded back, vivid and painful. The grand lecture hall, the applause she had once believed would carry her into a future of research and diplomacy. The scholarship letter she had clutched with trembling joy. And then the crash, the phone call, the hospital bed, the mountain of bills that demanded sacrifice. She swallowed hard, answering honestly, her voice steady despite the sting of loss. Life doesn't always follow the path we plan. My parents died when I was 18. My younger brother was injured during his first year of college. Someone had to care for him. The scholarship could not cover what we needed. I traded Oxford for survival. Al-Shaim was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes carried a depth that told her he understood more than most ever could. Finally, he said softly, "You chose responsibility over ambition. That does not diminish you. It reveals your strength." Nia's throat tightened. No one had ever framed her sacrifices as strength. To most people, she was simply a janitor who had failed to reach her potential. But here, from the lips of a billionaire who had seen the world, came validation she had never dared hope for. A knock interrupted them. Walter's voice, insistent. "Mr. Al-Shaim, we're ready to resume when you are." The Tycoon inclined his head to Nia. "Walk with me," he said. And together, they returned to the conference room. By late afternoon, the building buzzed with whispers. Word had spread like wildfire. Employees invented reasons to walk past the glass walls of the conference room, eager to glimpse the janitor seated beside the billionaire. Shock, disbelief, even envy rippled through the halls. Is that Nia? The night cleaner? She's translating for Al-Shaim? Conversations fizzled into stunned silence when she passed, mop forgotten, presence elevated. When the meeting finally concluded, Al-Shaim shook hands with each executive. But when he reached Nia, he clasped her hand in both of his and said in English for all to hear, "Miss Harper, your assistance was invaluable. I look forward to continuing our discussions tomorrow." With that, he and his entourage departed, leaving a wake of stunned executives. Walter cleared his throat, his tone awkward. "Well, Nia, that was unexpected. We'll need to discuss tomorrow's arrangements." Marina's smile was brittle, venom behind her eyes. Yes, what a lovely surprise. But let's not overstate things. She strung a few phrases together. Anyone can download Rosetta Stone these days. Nia met her gaze calmly, then replied, "Oxford University, Ms. Westfield. I studied there before life took a different turn." She nodded politely to Walter, then quietly excused herself. She did not gloat, did not linger. She simply returned to her cart, head held higher than it had been in years. As she pushed it toward the elevator, whispers trailed after her. Marina's voice rose, sharp with disdain. "This changes nothing. She's still just the janitor." But Nia knew better. She had felt it the moment she spoke, the moment the Tycoon smiled, the moment the air shifted in that room. Everything had changed, and it had started with a single sentence spoken in Arabic, and the courage to answer. That night, in her modest apartment in Brooklyn, Nia barely slept. The events replayed endlessly in her mind. The stunned faces, Al-Shaim's recognition, his words echoing inside her. "I remember you." When dawn broke, she was still awake, staring at the ceiling. Then a knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find a courier, holding a sealed envelope embossed with gold. Inside, written in elegant script, were words that made her breath catch. "Miss Harper, your assistance yesterday was invaluable. I would be honored if you would attend today's meetings as my personal interpreter. A car will await you at 9 a.m. respectfully. Khaled Al-Shaim." Her brother Jordan's spoon clattered into his cereal bowl as she read the letter aloud. His wide eyes filled with awe. "Nia, this is it. This is your moment." And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe he might be right. The transformation, a janitor at the table. The morning air in Brooklyn was crisp, tinged with the faint smell of roasted coffee from the cafe across the street. Nia Harper stood in front of her mirror, her heart thudding so hard it seemed to echo in the silence of her apartment. The letter from Khaled Al-Shaim lay on her dresser, its golden embossing glowing faintly in the early light as though it had been forged in a different world. A world where janitors did not exist, where scholarship dreams had not been abandoned, and where women like her stood in lecture halls instead of scrubbing their echoes. She touched the edge of the envelope again as if to remind herself that it was real, that she had not dreamed it all. Behind her, Jordan leaned against the doorframe, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep but bright with pride. He had spent half the night pacing, insisting that this was more than an opportunity. It was the door she had been waiting for, one she had earned 1,000 times over but had never been allowed to walk through. "You can't show up in your uniform," he had argued, his voice trembling with urgency. "Not today. Today you're not just a cleaner. You're a voice, a scholar, a bridge between two worlds. You need to look like it." The problem was Nia's closet had never been built for a stage like this. Her wardrobe was simple, practical, the kind of clothes chosen for comfort and necessity, not for boardrooms and billionaires. The only professional attire she owned was the faded navy uniform, folded neatly on the back of her door. She had argued against spending money they didn't have, but Jordan, stubborn in his loyalty, had already made calls. By sunrise, their neighbor Anna had arrived, her sister Maria in tow, carrying a garment bag as though it contained salvation. Now, Nia stood in a dress of deep navy blue, elegant in its simplicity, altered quickly by Maria's skilled hands. It hugged her form modestly, the hem brushing her knees, the fabric soft yet professional. Her shoes were borrowed, low heels that clicked softly against the floor. Her curls were pinned back, not hidden but framed in a way that gave her face an undeniable dignity. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her from the mirror. She looked older, wiser, as if the weight of sacrifice had finally carved itself into strength. At precisely 9, a sleek black car waited outside their building. Its tinted windows reflected the morning sun, drawing curious stares from neighbors who had never seen such a vehicle pause in their humble street. Jordan stood by the door, his hands shoved in his pockets, pretending to be casual but failing. When Nia stepped into the hallway, he straightened, his voice low and thick with emotion. "Go show them who you really are." The ride to Halberton Tower felt surreal. The car glided smoothly through the city, past familiar streets that now looked foreign. For years, Nia had walked those sidewalks invisible, a ghost carrying a mop and bucket. Now she sat in the back of a luxury vehicle, the city unfolding outside like a stage set for her entrance. She pressed her palms together to steady herself, whispering verses of Arabic poetry under her breath as if summoning courage from the words that had once been her lifeline. At the tower, the reaction was immediate. Employees clustered near the lobby, whispering in shock as the janitor they had always ignored stepped out of a car that bore the insignia of a Saudi delegation. The same marble floor she had polished countless nights reflected her borrowed heels as she walked across them, not with a mop, but with measured confidence. Some lowered their voices to speculate. Others didn't bother hiding their stares. She ignored them all. Walter Langford was waiting at the conference room doors, his smile stretched thin, his eyes flickering with something between resentment and forced approval. "Miss Harper," he said stiffly as though the title tasted bitter on his tongue. "Welcome. Mr. Al-Shaim is expecting you." Inside, the room was already alive with quiet conversation. Al-Shaim stood near the window, his silhouette framed by the glittering skyline. When he turned and saw her, he smiled, not the polite smile of business, but one of recognition, of genuine respect. "Miss Harper," he said warmly, "thank you for coming. Today we continue." The hours that followed were unlike anything Nia had ever experienced. Once again, she sat beside the Tycoon, translating not just words but worlds. The executives, though still stunned, had little choice but to accept her presence. Even Marina, who had dismissed her so cruelly the day before, sat in tense silence, her jaw tight as Naya's voice carried across the table with clarity and authority. Every phrase she delivered seemed to shift the dynamic further. When the executive stumbled through cultural missteps, she smoothed them into bridges. When Al-Shame's advisors expressed subtle reservations in Arabic, she translated with honesty but tact, ensuring no offense was given while no truth was lost. The air of mistrust that had hung over the negotiations evaporated slowly, replaced by something rare: mutual respect. During a break, Al-Shame drew Nia aside into the corridor. His voice lowered, his words intimate yet firm. "You do more than translate. You interpret intent. You understand nuance. You see beyond what is said to what is meant. That skill is rarer than gold in business. Do you realize what you're doing here?" Nia met his gaze, her voice steady despite the tremor of disbelief still beneath her surface. "I am simply giving words their full weight, sir." He shook his head. "No, you are giving people their dignity. You are making this room human again." The words struck her with such force that she had to look away, her throat tightening. For years she had been invisible, erased by circumstance, her knowledge locked away in silence. And now someone with power recognized not only her ability but her humanity. It felt like breathing for the first time after years underwater. By late afternoon, the second day of meetings concluded with breakthroughs the company had not anticipated. Al-Shame's advisors, impressed by the fluidity of communication, proposed investment terms that exceeded initial expectations. Walter tried to mask his astonishment, claiming credit for the team's preparation, but even he knew the truth. Everyone in that room did. Without Nia, the deal would have faltered, lost to mistrust and miscommunication. As the delegation prepared to leave, Al-Shame approached Nia once more. His voice carried the weight of decision. "Miss Harper, I leave for Riyadh in 3 days. I would like you to accompany my team as cultural advisor and interpreter. Consider this an official offer. You will not be cleaning floors again unless you choose to polish the marble halls of history." The room erupted in whispers. Executives gawked. Marina's face drained of all color, and Walter's smile froze into something brittle and false. But Nia stood still, her heart thundering in her chest, the enormity of the moment crashing over her like a wave. She thought of her brother, of the years of sacrifice, of the nights spent alone with books of Arabic poetry, clinging to a dream she thought had died. And now, that dream was alive again. She bowed her head slightly, her voice trembling but resolute. "It would be an honor, sir." In that moment, Nia Harper was no longer invisible. She was seen not as a janitor, but as the woman she had always been, a scholar, a bridge, a voice strong enough to silence a room. The new beginning, a voice that could not be silenced. The 3 days that followed felt like a whirlwind, each moment pressing against Nia Harper's chest with a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. For years her life had been structured around the quiet rhythm of a mop and bucket, her nights defined by silence, her days spent protecting her younger brother from the weight of their shared circumstances. And now she stood at the cusp of something she had not dared to imagine in years. A life defined not by survival, but by recognition, purpose, and possibility. The offer Khaled Al-Shame had extended was not simply a job, it was a restoration of everything she had once been forced to abandon. The morning after the second day of negotiations, the car arrived again at her Brooklyn apartment. But this time the neighbors were not merely curious, they were awestruck. Word had spread like wildfire through the building and beyond, about the janitor who spoke flawless Arabic, about the Saudi tycoon who had chosen her voice over executives with polished degrees and suits worth more than her entire apartment. Children peered from windows, old women shook their heads in wonder, and men nodded quietly as though acknowledging a secret triumph that belonged not just to Nia, but to all who had ever been overlooked. Jordan stood beside her at the door, his face glowing with pride. "Go," he whispered. "Don't look back." Inside the car, she clutched her notebook tightly. For years, she had filled it with verses, translations, and fragments of research no one had ever seen. Now it would serve as her anchor, a reminder that her journey had not been wasted, that the hours she had spent reading in stolen moments, the sacrifices she had made, had all prepared her for this. The car pulled smoothly into Manhattan, its tinted windows shielding her from the curious eyes outside. But within her, something unshielded was awakening, her courage. At Halberton Tower, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. No longer was she treated as invisible. The security guards who once nodded absently now stood straighter when she passed. Receptionists whispered behind their hands, eyes wide with wonder. Even the executives who had once brushed past her with careless indifference now regarded her with a mixture of unease and reluctant respect. Marina's fury was palpable, her lips tight, her eyes sharp, but she said nothing. Words, after all, had failed her in the face of Nia's truth. Inside the boardroom, the third and final day of negotiations began. Once again, Nia sat beside Khalid al-Shaim, not as an afterthought, not as a substitute, but as the appointed interpreter, her presence as vital as any executive in the room. And once again, her voice carried with clarity, turning potential conflict into dialogue, transforming misunderstandings into bridges. When complex terms arose, she did not merely translate, she explained. When cultural nuances clashed, she softened them into harmony. The tension that had threatened to destroy the deal on the first day had evaporated, replaced by a sense of mutual trust that only she had made possible. By the end of that day, the contract was signed. A $200 million investment sealed with handshakes, smiles, and promises of partnership. The executives erupted in restrained celebration, their relief washing over the room like a tide. But the true recognition belonged to Nia. Khalid al-Shaim turned to her before the delegation departed, his voice resonant with finality. This partnership was built not by contracts alone, but by understanding. And that understanding came through you. Miss Harper, I will not forget this. The world should not forget this. The next morning, another letter arrived at her door, heavier than the last, stamped with the seal of al-Shaim's personal office. Inside was a formal offer, an official position as cultural advisor and interpreter within his global investment group, with travel to Riyadh, London, and beyond. The salary was more than she had ever dared to imagine. The benefits included educational grants, resources to pay off debts, and opportunities that stretched beyond her own future into her brother's. Jordan, upon hearing the details, collapsed into the chair with tears streaming down his face. You did it, Nia. You did it for both of us. All those nights you gave up for me. Now it's your turn. The day she boarded the plane to Riyadh, the world felt different beneath her feet. At the airport, dressed in a tailored suit provided by al-Shaim's staff, she no longer looked like the janitor the world had ignored. She looked like the scholar she had always been, the professional she had always dreamed of becoming, and yet more than that, she looked like a woman who had refused to let circumstance define her worth. As she took her seat on the plane, the city of New York spread out below, the skyscrapers gleaming, the streets familiar yet now distant. She closed her eyes, whispering softly in Arabic, "Every journey begins with a single word." For her, that word had been spoken in a boardroom when no one else dared to answer. Months later, news of her transformation circulated in business journals. In quiet conversations across both New York and Riyadh, executives who had once dismissed her now invoked her name with respect. Scholars who had once praised her papers found themselves astonished that she had been rediscovered in the most unlikely of places. And in the Brooklyn apartment where Jordan still coded late into the night, framed photographs of his sister abroad now adorned the walls. Nia in Riyadh, standing at the center of a conference, Nia in London addressing a crowd, Nia standing beside Khalid al-Shaim, her presence no longer surprising but expected. But the true legacy was not the salary or the travel or even the recognition. It was something deeper. It was the message that rippled outward, whispered among janitors, waitresses, security guards, and others who lived in the shadows of gleaming towers. That invisibility is never permanent, that knowledge cannot be erased by a uniform, that dignity can survive even when the world refuses to see it. Nia had spoken one sentence in a moment of silence, and that sentence had become her key. On the anniversary of that day, she returned to Halberton Tower, not as an employee but as a guest. The lobby gleamed as always, polished by unseen hands. She paused by the spot where she had once stood with her mop, remembering the weight of invisibility, the sting of dismissal, the quiet fury of being overlooked, and then she smiled. Her reflection shining in the marble floor she no longer cleaned. She was proof that a single voice, once silenced, could rise to change everything. And as she walked past the boardroom where it all began, the words of Khalid al-Shaim echoed once more in her memory. You are making this room human again." For the first time in years, Nia Harper knew with certainty that she would never be invisible again.